atheism is the position of not believing in a God. It has nothing to say, if let me finish, or I swear I'm going to hang up on you. It has nothing to say about methods of epistemology. It may be derived from examining methods of epistemology, but atheism itself has no position on methods of epistemology.
But I thought it was based on logic and reason.
No, because you don't listen. What I said is that some have reached this position as the result of exercising logic and reason, and some haven't. That is, do you not understand a causal chain? We begin with logic and reason, and some people have come to the conclusion that the God claims have not met their burden of proof. That does not mean that atheism is generating a position about epistemology. It means that an epistemological position has been used to generate this tentative conclusion about a specific claim.
And how do you test that claim?
Test what claim?
The claim that logic and reason has proven that their claims are bad.
Okay, so the claim, some God exists, is the claim that needs to be tested and demonstrated, and until it's done so, by default, it has not done so.
Well, there's only two choices. Either God exists or he doesn't.
Correct.
And if God doesn't exist, then logic and reason are impossible.
How do you know that?
How do you get there?
Because you can't use logic and reason to test and prove that logic. You have to start from a...
No, that's not that doesn't answer the question. What the question is, how does the absence of a God make the processes of logic and reason impossible for minds to engage in? You haven't answered that question, and in order to do so, first you have to demonstrate. You have to put this as a falsifiable situation, right? You have to, in a universe in which a God doesn't exist, what would we expect the conditions to be? Okay, you have to be able to speak on that meaningfully. You have to be able to give examples that can then be tested and demonstrated to be more likely to be factual than not.
And so,
I mean, in a universe without a God, you're basically saying that people couldn't think.
Correct.
Now, how have you arrived at that conclusion?
Because in order to think, in order to reason, I can't go along the line to say that I can reason and I understand something because I understand it.
Well, first off, why couldn't you exactly? I mean, how does the act of understanding make the process of understanding incomprehensible? I mean, we learn by doing things. We learn by interacting with our world. And there's a whole field called epistemology, as Matt just pointed out, which is about understanding the processes by which we derive knowledge. This is an actual field of study.
Yes,
so understanding the act of understanding and knowing, how is that contingent upon an invisible, all-powerful deity existing at all? That's the claim you've made, that without this deity existing, the process...
Or to be very specific, the question that Martin asked, which I would really love an answer to, is, in a universe without a God, you have asserted that living, thinking beings couldn't actually think, and I want to know how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, how did you derive that conclusion?
Because reason and logic are impossible in and of themselves.
No.
Hang on. What led you to that conclusion? What made you think that? How are reason and logic? First off, explain what you mean by that sentence.
To validate my reason or logic.
Why not?
Because it's circular reasoning.
Only if you're talking about absolutes. There's a difference when you're talking about an internally consistent. So, like, for example, I can't tell you, we cannot ever solve the problem of hard solipsism. It's possible that everything I experience could be an illusion. I could be a brain in a vat. I could be stuck in the matrix. There is no solution to that currently, and there may never be. But that doesn't matter, because I still experience a reality, and I'm still forced by practical necessity to evaluate that reality by that reality's rules, because to not do so results in your demise.
Well, but the rules that's like the rules for understanding language. You don't when you look and you see something, you don't actually see the matter and the process. You just see the visual input.
I don't understand what that has to do with what we just said.
then your brain has to then process it
So what?
To understand it.
Yes. So what?
And so without prior knowledge, which is what comes from God, you would have nothing.
Well, wait, stop.
There's no atheistic, there's no evolutionary idea or model that can account for human consciousness.
Okay, just jurist, until you stop just asserting as an axiom that this comes from God, we're not going to get anywhere because you still haven't proved that. First off, some things that have not been shown to exist cannot be asserted as the cause of things. So you have not even shown that this God exists, let alone be able to state as an axiom these processes, these thought processes, the processes of reasoning and understanding originate in God or must necessarily originate in God.
And not only that, but you just made a fallacious argument which serves as the foundation for everything you've said. Because you've said that without a God, there is no explanation for consciousness. Now, let's assume for a second that we don't currently have an explanation for consciousness. There are people who think that we do have some good understandings and explanations for consciousness, but let's assume that you're right. What you're doing there is making an argument from ignorance fallacy. The fact that we have not demonstrated or have not yet come up with a proper theory of mind that explains consciousness means that God is the only answer for this. And that is simply a fallacy, and it's the foundation of why you're so amazingly wrong right now.
Okay.
Well, that and the problem of simply putting in your premises a bunch of unsupported statements, like X comes from God.
You've got nothing but assertions, and when pressed on it, your response is, well, you guys don't have a better explanation, which is a fallacy.
Well, but you guys don't have any explanation.
Goodbye. Yeah. If I'm going to sit here and explain to you the fallacy in great detail, and you're just going to reassert what you've asserted before, we're done. Sorry.
Yeah. The whole point of the argument from ignorance fallacy is even if we didn't have a better explanation, that doesn't make yours right by default.
Even if we found out that evolution was entirely wrong, that we had gotten it all wrong, that doesn't say anything at all about creationism. Yeah. Even if we find out that the Big Bang cosmology model is wrong, that doesn't mean that God or universe creating pixies or whatever explanation you think is interesting is actually the right one. The time to claim that an answer or an explanation is the right one or the one that is most likely right is when it has been supported by sufficient evidence and when it is reasonable and consistent within this. It doesn't matter about this, oh, you can't prove reason with reason. Well, actually, I'm not going to get into a big long tirade on the laws of the logical absolutes, but you can find me talking about them on previous shows, and I'm not going to bore everybody else to tears with that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And again, it's just so many of these conversations don't go anywhere because the Christian insists upon making these axiomatic statements that are things that they don't realize they have to prove those things. Those are the things they're seeking to prove.
Well, this guy, by the way, emailed and said he was going to call in, and he's been running around over the course of a couple of days, putting comments all over YouTube videos, and it's very clear that he thinks, much like Shock of God, that he's got some kind of gotcha. And it's clear that he's been paying attention to the presuppositionalist knuckleheads like Seitan Bruggencate and Eric Hovind, who supposedly wanted to debate me, but evidently are just too doggone busy all the time to ever actually make it happen. Because I offered to take them both on 2-on-1, and they declined.
But I'd really like to know this. In a universe in which God doesn't exist, I mean, what do you think that universe would look like? What would be its laws? If thinking beings could not actually exist in a universe like that, explain why. Explain how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, not just what you think that universe would look like, but how it is that you derived that is what that universe would look like.
Yeah, because what can you possibly have studied?
And it's the other thing, which we kind of let him get away with for a while, which was he just keeps asserting God without defining God. There's no explanation for him. God is this panacea which serves as an explanation for the things that he can't explain. Oh, I can't explain consciousness, therefore God. Oh, we can't have an internally or an externally authorized reason, therefore God. Without realizing that it doesn't really matter. I mean, have you never played a computer video game, an adventure game in a science fiction fantasy universe that has its own set of rules? You can still use reason within that scope, within the rules that are apparent and evident in that universe, to figure out how to operate. And also, one of the things we talk about is we don't want to necessarily pretend that our own experience has this primacy of authentication, this, I experienced it, therefore it's true. We need to be able to identify people who are having experiences which are inconsistent with reality in order to, we put delusional people away,
right.
We put them on medications, we attempt to help them. Now, jurists and the others would say that the only reason we can do this is because we have reason and we have God. And I'm just going to use Occam's razor and excise that completely unnecessary God thing until you actually come around and demonstrate that it's not only necessary but true. Because quite frankly, the way we go about determining whether or not a claim is reasonable, we don't rely just on ourselves. And science doesn't rely on any individual. It's through repeated testing, attempts at falsification, peer review, this process of trying to demonstrate that somebody else is false, or that their position is false. That's the guts behind it. It doesn't matter if you think we're living in the ultimate reality or not. There's no problem with reasoning inside a model.
And it's always a bit funny to be told that you've got a circular argument going by somebody whose essential argument is logic and reason. God exists because logic and reason are impossible without God. We are able to use our logic and reason to talk about God because logic and reason are impossible without God.
And what's more, just for the
definition of a tautology, right?
Just for the people who haven't been down this road 50,000 times, and who constantly ask, hey, how do I respond to these presuppositionalists who are raising this stuff like this? This idea that God is required for reason and logic, because in order to avoid a circular argument, is itself false. Because if you listen to theologians, and the first question that you should ask and pop up is, can God change the laws of logic and reason? Can God violate those three foundational laws of identity? Can God make something itself and not itself at the same time, in the same way? And thinking theologians will respond, no. That these, and then they'll take the extra step of saying, because that's part of God's nature. Well, if it's part of God's nature, is there some reason that couldn't be part of the nature of the universe? Or even beyond the nature of truth statements entirely? You haven't demonstrated any sort of necessity towards God, and your God hasn't actually solved a problem. What you've done is just say, we need something outside of this, and that's God. Yeah. But you don't.
I really got into it on Twitter a few days back with somebody who was having this exact problem. They started bringing up the laws of logic and whether or not, how do we derive those? And then I was explaining that, look, these are descriptive and not proscriptive laws, which took them they had a great deal of difficulty being willing to understand the difference between those things. And then even when he did understand the difference between the thing or claimed to, he would still sort of make the same argument. I would try to tell him, in a universe with no living beings, A would still equal A, and it would not equal not A.
Yeah.
And he says, but without a mind, it's meaningless. I'm like, no.
Well, without a mind, it may in fact be meaningless, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be true.
But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
If you remove every mind from the universe, a rock is still a rock. It's just that there's nobody to recognize that it's a rock. And if you took a new brain and put it into that universe as the sole one, it could then eventually recognize these same truths.
Yeah, there are basic objective facts about reality that obtain without the need for minds to understand them.
Yeah. The fact that something is pointless if there isn't a mind doesn't mean it changes.
Correct.
Yeah. Because the recognition of absurdity or pointless is something that happens in the mind. Doesn't change. This kind of ties in with those ideas that we can change the universe by the way we think about things. That sort of
the secret.
What the bleep do we know, and the secret and all that.
Law of attraction.
Yeah.
If I just wish hard enough for a rainbow bunny who farts candy, I'll get one. Because the universe loves me.